The Trump administration's recent foreign policy moves, a halt on foreign aid, the shuttering of USAID, and an increasingly assertive stance in international negotiations, have stirred debate about the future of America's soft power.
As we look back, American power has been quite impressive militarily and economically, but the soft power component has been cyclical. And I think we're now on the edge of a downturn in the cycle.
At a moment when global influence has become fragmented and alliances more uncertain than ever, questions linger about America's role in shaping global norms through diplomacy and cultural influence. And with China steadily expanding its global reach, does America's shift away from traditional soft power tools risk weakening its international standing?
When you declare America first and you start berating your allies or friendly countries, you reduce trust and you reduce attraction.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, the mind behind the concept of soft power itself, Professor Joseph Nye, helps us shed light on how Washington's recent decisions fit into the larger story of America's influence. As the world adapts to shifting alliances and new economic realities, will another tool take the place of soft power for the United States?
The question of whether Trump has a vision of a long-term strategy. He's not a real strategist. And I think he thinks of himself as a great deal maker. And he thinks that, well, with authoritarians like Putin and Xi Jinping, he can come to terms and do deals.
How has China historically capitalized on periods when American soft power waned?
There will be tensions, and the key question is, how do you manage those tensions to make sure that neither the U.S. nor China miscalculates?
And what will it take to regain that power and that trust?
The administration's actions have indeed eroded trust, and trust is hard to regain.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. And we are honored today to welcome back to Network 2020 Professor Joseph Nye for a talk about power in today's unsteady world. If you've heard the term soft power, you have likely heard of Professor Joseph Nye. His storied career weaves through academia and the U.S. government, and he is one of the most important foreign policy thinkers of our time, drawing on his experience in government and using the freedom of academia to wrestle with questions about geopolitical power. His most recent book, A Life in the American Century, chronicles his life and work against the backdrop of the decades of power that the U.S. was fortunate to have in the post-World War II years, taking us through his work on nonproliferation and his coining of the term soft power and beyond. And as I learned as well, there's some good anecdotes in here, he is also a prize-winning vegetable farmer. Professor Nye, it is such an honor to have you with us here today.
The pleasure is mine.
So just to start off with an easy question. You've been a prolific chronicler of the sources of geopolitical power over the decades, focusing on the interplay of traditional forms of power like economic and military, as well as soft power. And you also understand the complicating dynamics, such as the power of multinationals and other non-state actors like terrorist organizations, as well as the impact of trends like globalization and advances in technology and information. So when you're looking at all of these different levels and layers and looking at that arc of geopolitical power, what stands out to you about where the current moment falls?
Well, in terms of understanding what we mean by power, it's the ability to affect others to get what you want. And you can do that three ways. You do it with coercion, you can do it with payment, and you can do it with attraction. And that's basically three dimensions of power. Soft power, which is the ability to get what you want through attraction, is a complement, not necessarily an alternative to hard power. But when you can have all three put together, you're likely to do better. If you look back at the Cold War period, the United States had a good deal of soft power, The saying goes that Europe was divided into two empires, Soviet Empire and American Empire, but the difference was the American Empire was an empire by invitation. The Europeans were attracted to us. They wanted us there. That meant that we didn't have to do things like the Soviets did to Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. But we also made some mistakes. The Vietnam War was one. We lost a lot of soft power at that time. The Iraq War was another. So American soft power goes up and down more so than its hard economic and military power. And I would say today we're going through a down period. When you declare America first and you start berating your allies or friendly countries, you reduce trust and you reduce attraction. So as we look back, American power has been quite impressive militarily and economically, but the soft power component has been cyclical, and I think we're now on the edge of a downturn in the cycle.
Right. Thank you for that. Speaking of where we are today, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on the closure, the U.S. closure, recent closure of USAID. The majority of grants have been terminated, and this assistance agency worked in over 100 countries. Now, I'd be curious, one, to hear from you. Was that a form of soft power, or was USAID something else? And if so, how big of an impact do you think this curtailment will have on U.S. soft power?
Well, AID, and particularly humanitarian assistance, does produce a good deal of attraction when you get the medicines that say gift to the American people, or the bag of flour that says gift to the American people. That helps. And ironically, we spend very little on it, something in the range of $50 billion as compared to over $800 billion for our Pentagon hard power. On the other hand, it's at least with half the population, aid has never been very popular, and it's an easy target. And so essentially when Elon Musk said he was going to feed the AID agency into the wood chipper, there were enough people who supported that he was able to get away with it. But I do think it's cost us. I mean, I think all those people who were influenced by those bags of grain or the bad medicines that said gift of the U.S. people now don't have that positive attraction.
Thank you. I'd like to just stay on this for a little bit, because we had a bit of a spirited discussion in my grad school WhatsApp group I went to a public policy school, so many people were notably in that field, but there were some detractors, students who had been, or alumni who were from developing countries and saw USAID not as a force for good, but as something that could sometimes undermine institutions. And so I'm curious just to understand your take on the flip side of the coin, and sort of how, is there a downside to what we perceive as this soft power?
Well, there's a downside to foreign aid, in the sense that if it tries to substitute for domestic institutions rather than build those institutions, and if it develops a dependency rather than independence of entrepreneurs in the country, then aid has a negative side. So I think that may explain why some of your friends or colleagues were skeptical. But on the other hand, there are large portions of aid, such as humanitarian assistance, medical assistance, or President Bush's PEPFAR, which was to reduce HIV/AIDS in Africa, which are it's hard to be against them. So I think you can criticize AID, the agency, in terms of some of its programs, but the idea of abolishing it is a little bit like amputation because you have a sore toe.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to the role of multinational companies and other businesses and where they fall in the spectrum of power. And from your perspective, what is the role of American businesses in this whole power dynamic?
Well, businesses play a very important role. I mean, in terms of economic power, the success of American business is extremely important in terms of our hard power. But businesses also play a role in soft power. I mean, where an American brand is popular, it tends to lead to a more positive attitude toward the United States. So, the joke that Coca-Cola is an international source of soft power. Yes, it's a global brand, but it's still identified with the United States. So business plays an important role.
Thank you. Recently, Network 2020 held an event where we were looking at the retreat of the United States from the WHO, the World Health Organization. And one of the points that emerged during the conversation was the role that cities and states play in maintaining the global health infrastructure. And I thought that this was just a really interesting take because as power adjusts, other nodes adjust as well. And so I'm curious, when you're looking at the U.S. role on the world stage, do you see similar avenues of soft power emerging in this current realignment? Are there sort of unexpected things that are bubbling up?
Well, remember, a lot of a country's soft power comes from its civil society, not from the government actions. I mean, obviously, government actions affect attractiveness positively or negatively. But the fact that there are an awful lot of foreign students or moviegoers who want to watch Hollywood movies or attend American universities or benefit from American foundations, that's a great source of soft power. So even when the government does stupid things, that positive element from civil society is still there. So the more that foundations, nonprofits, and others are directly involved in helping other countries, the better for American soft power. And even though I think we're going through a period where, under the Trump administration, our governmental soft power is going to be in a recession, it's not necessarily true for our civil society.
Thank you. That's a great point and a good reminder. When we last spoke 4 years ago, U.S.-China relations seem to have gotten worse. I'd be curious to get your perspective on where you see the relationship these days and how China is reacting to the current U.S. approach to the world.
Well, I think that you're right that the U.S.-China tensions have gotten worse. I think there is a built-in cause of tension between the U.S. and China, which is that China is a rising power, and they pose a challenge to the United States. They like to be dominant in Asia, and the Americans regard ourselves as a Pacific country. After all, one of our states is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and some of our close allies like Japan and South Korea and Australia are obviously on the borders of China or in the region of China. So there are causes for tension, but they can be managed. And unfortunately, I think the management part has been getting worse rather than better.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it'd be nice to be able to blame the Trump administration in its first term for that, but in fact, I think it's more accurate to blame China. After the American recession in 2008, 2009, which was caused by Wall Street, the Chinese decided that the United States was in decline, and they dropped Deng Xiaoping's policy, which was to take your time, and became more assertive, more aggressive. And that assertive foreign policy created anxiety among many of Americans' allies. And it also led to Chinese actions like militarizing artificial islands in the South China Sea that went directly against what they told us they wouldn't do. So well before Trump came in to office in 2017, there was already beginning to be tension growing between the U.S. and China, and I think the Chinese share blame for that. Trump came in and with tariffs and rhetoric, he poured gasoline on the fire, but the Chinese lit the fire.
So, if you were in the position of advising an administration right now on how to best manage this relationship, what would you recommend doing now that things seem to be on fire, as you say?
Well, I think the key question is to make sure that neither the U.S. nor China miscalculates. And that means that the areas where there could be miscalculation, particularly Taiwan or South China Sea, we have to be clear about our deterrent capability so that if Xi Jinping thinks that, well, now I'll try this, he has to say, well, wait, maybe it's not such a wise idea. I might not win. So having military preparedness and having allies such as we have with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, and also beginning to improve our relations with India, which has its own problems with China. These are the elements of a successful policy. And then in addition to that, you can keep high-level contacts with the Chinese about regulating particular problems so that they don't spin out of control. But I think it's going to be a period where there will be tensions, and the key question is, how do you manage those tensions?
Thank you. I've heard it said from some people that Trump's vision of the world order may be one in which there's sort of a U.S. leadership within its own domain, China within its own domain, and then Russia within its. What do you make of this assessment?
Well, nobody quite knows what's in Trump's mind. Maybe not even Trump. He's not a real strategist, but he is someone who judges the world by personal reactions and to his own ego. And I think he thinks of himself as a great deal maker. And he thinks that, well, with authoritarians like Putin and Xi Jinping, he can come to terms and do deals. And that will be stabilizing. The problem is what happens to third parties when those deals are done. What happens to Ukraine and Europe? What happens to our alliance with NATO? And in Asia, what happens to Taiwan or the Philippines if a deal is done? So the question of whether Trump has a vision of a long-term strategy as opposed to a inclination based on his background in New York real estate and his personal narcissism, it's hard to detect because it goes up and down. And I think we'll just have to wait and see how it plays out.
Thanks. Related to this idea of Trump being able to cut deals with figures like Putin, I'd like to turn to arms control. You were very instrumental in the early days of nonproliferation diplomacy, I think taking an approach that employed a lot of diplomatic finesse to put the brakes on the drive toward nuclear arms. So, what is your take on the current approach to diplomacy in that realm, given the threats globally and within the arms control space? Do you think that this approach, such as opening talks with Putin, which, as you know, US-Russia relations have been not the most talkative, communicative recently, does that increase the likelihood of critical arms control treaties, particularly with New START set to expire in less than a year?
Well, I think the Trump's opening to Putin may actually help to get a renewal of the bilateral arms control treaty that's called New START, which expires in 26. That would be on the plus side. On the negative side, I think the fear of allies that they're going to be sold out by the Trump administration leads them to feel that they can't count on the American nuclear umbrella for protection and may need to have nuclear capacity themselves. It's interesting, if you go back to the 1960s, John F. Kennedy thought there would be 25 countries with nuclear weapons by the 1970s. If you look at the number of countries today, it's 9, which is not great, but it's a lot better than 25. And what's interesting is that it's held relatively stable for the last decade. The worry that people have now is that if you look at the feelings in Europe that Trump is not going to come to the defense of NATO, that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons after the U.S., Britain, and Russia promised that they would defend Ukraine at the Budapest Memorandum. And obviously, that has been violated. And the feeling that Trump is taking Putin's side in the negotiations on Ukraine, where he's given away Ukraine's bargaining points even before the negotiations start. That's led to calls in countries like Poland for thinking about developing nuclear weapons. And in Germany, there's also discussion, which would have been unthinkable a few years ago. And similarly, in East Asia, the South Koreans are beginning to worry about the credibility of the U.S. nuclear guarantee. And there's a fair amount of discussion in South Korea about developing their own nuclear weapon. So I think on the nonproliferation side, the Trump policies have weakened nonproliferation, but on the bilateral arms control, they might actually be able to renew the New START treaty.
Thank you. Just a question now. You've remarked on the cyclical nature of soft power and the role of trust. Could you expand on that a little bit and the ways in which current U.S. policy is impacting trust in particular, and then what it might take for the U.S. to regain its soft power?
Well, on the trust element, if you look at Europe and NATO, NATO is the rare case of a successful military alliance that has lasted for over 7 decades. And that's because the Europeans trusted the Americans to live up to their promises. When Trump says publicly that if countries don't spend enough on defense, then the Russians can do whatever the hell they want to, that begins to make people in Europe think, are we going to hold on to our promises? But even more important, when we basically threatened Denmark over the question of Greenland, or when we talk about uh, you know Ukraine having to make concessions to Russia, then other European countries think, can we trust the Americans? So in that sense, I think that the the administration's actions have indeed eroded trust, and trust is hard to regain. I mean, you can say to Europeans, "Well, hold on. By 2029, we'll be back with a full backing for Article 5, which is the mutual security guarantee in NATO." And the Europeans say, yeah, but how do I know that then after that you won't elect somebody else who will change their mind, as we've seen in 2016 and 2024? It's hard to regain that trust.
It's true. And it's friends and foes alike. I listened this morning to Iran saying that they wouldn't want to talk to Trump again based on the fact that he pulled out of the JCPOA. And so when we're doing that to friends, let alone foes, it's an interesting world. In recent conflicts, the U.S. has relied heavily on sanctions, often in concert with allies, to use economic power as a tool of achieving policy objectives. Where do you see the use of sanctions and the power dynamic headed, just based on the heavy use that it seems that we've had recently?
Well, sanctions are always an imperfect instrument. We tend to use them because they fill a middle ground between verbal admonishments, which don't do much good, and military action, which may be too expensive or counterproductive. So putting on economic sanctions is a middle ground, if you want. It's very tempting for politicians. On the other hand, they work differently under different circumstances. There was a study done at the Peterson Institute for International Economics of the effectiveness of sanctions over the decades, and they work about a third of the time. And they may work in the short run, but then in the long term, the target of the sanctions learns how to evade them or escape them. So sanctions are a mixed bag because of filling this middle ground between admonishment and military use. You're going to see them, and often. But calculating them under what conditions are they likely to be effective and how long will they be effective, it takes a lot more sophistication than we sometimes see when we're just trying to fill a domestic political need to say we're doing something.
Great point. We have a question about whether the U.S. should be concerned about China's use of soft power. This person is asking, particularly in Africa, with Confucius Institutes, workshops and scholarships for studying China. So they're concerned about the Africa piece, but I'd love to just broaden that out too and understand your take on the Confucius Institutes, which I think are largely now no longer in the U.S. And so how does that play into a variety of viewpoints in China's soft power?
Well, on Confucius Institutes as such, they're designed to support teaching of Chinese culture and language. And if they do that openly and honestly, there's nothing to fear. The problem is that they'll be distorted. And for example, you can't invite a Tibetan to university because the Confucius Institute director opposes it or something. So that's one problem. But the Chinese have a problem with their not just the Confucius Institutes, but with their soft power generally. There are two problems. One is they have conflicts with many of their neighbors. So if you have Chinese soldiers killing Indian soldiers on the Himalayan border, which has happened. A Confucius Institute in New Delhi doesn't do much good in making China attractive. The other problem China has is that insists on tight party control of civil society. And going back to what I said a few minutes ago, if a lot of a country's soft power comes from its civil society, the more you censor and restrain your civil society, the less soft power it will produce. So China develops a brilliant artist like Ai Weiwei, and he winds up either in jail or in exile. Well, that's not the way to increase your soft power. As for how China compares to the U.S. on soft power, the Pew Foundation, Pew Charitable Trust, did a survey of 23 countries in 2023, and they found that more countries, the U.S. was more attractive than China. But the one continent where it was close to being a tie was in Africa.
Then I'm going to skip ahead to this question because I think it plays nicely after this. And the question is, given the evolving nature of international power dynamics and the increasing influence of China's strategic investments through initiatives like the Belt and Road, how can the U.S. recalibrate its soft power strategy to maintain its global standing?
Well, I think we should be aware of the fact that we have still a good deal of soft power, which comes from the nature of our society, and we should avoid either curtailing that or turning it into propaganda. If the U.S. information, Voice of America, becomes a propaganda instrument rather than a presenter of news that's objective and can be self-critical, then we give up the soft power that comes from the credibility of the Voice of America. And apparently there's some dangers that we're moving in that direction. If you look at the AID, which we've already discussed, curtailing the humanitarian aid programs really doesn't make sense. And there the question is, I doubt that they'll be able to restore or be willing to restore AID as an agency, but within the State Department, they should be reorganizing or setting up something that does the same job of humanitarian assistance. So there are things that we can do to help our soft power resources. I'm not sure we're going to do them.
We do have a question that takes off on your last point, which is if USAID was to be restructured and refunded, commensurate with President Kennedy's vision as articulated in 1961 when it was created, what activities would you suggest be continued and which should be discontinued in order to enhance U.S. soft power?
Well, I think the activities that rest on or heavily on humanitarian assistance not only are self-evidently helpful, but they also probably do the most for attractiveness. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is focused on infrastructure, building roads and airports and so forth. And we should do some of that. But I think I would place my top priority on humanitarian assistance. It's interesting that it was George W. Bush who developed what is called PEPFAR, which was a program to help do and treat AIDS in Africa. And by most scientific estimates, it saved millions of lives. And so my priority, if we were to restore aid as an institution or to have its function filled by some other institution within the State Department, I would start with the humanitarian end.
Thank you. And what are your views, this questioner writes, on the global public good agenda at this particular juncture, when there is a challenge at the multilateral level to work collectively to provide these necessary and underprovided goods? And which institutions or countries can play a more active role in advancing this agenda when we witness a U.S. redefinition of its engagement at the multilateral level?
Well, I think there are two clear examples of global public goods. One is preventing damage from global warming, climate change, and the other is preventing damage from pandemics, which we know are going to happen again. And, we saw over 1 million Americans killed by COVID and over 1 million Chinese killed by COVID, and the same thing for many other countries. And we know that epidemiologists tell us that that's not the last epidemic. And in those circumstances, being able to organize others to share scientific information, early warning systems, and so forth, is in our interest, but it's also in the global interest. And that's why I think that President Trump's withdrawal from the World Health Organization is a mistake. There are lots of ways to criticize the WHO, and it's not perfect by any means, but that's not a good reason to withdraw. It's a reason to reform. And similarly, President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords and calling global climate change a hoax, that's not the way to mobilize opinion to deal with the long-term damages that are going to be done by climate change. So those are two concrete examples.
So my big takeaway from this conversation is that we need more open civil society, philanthropy, entertainment. All of that is what will really keep U.S. soft power as one of its strands of overall power.
Well, I think our openness, including self-criticism, is a source of attraction. And it leads me to have a degree of optimism, though very guarded. In that new memoir that you mentioned at the beginning, I conclude it by saying, I end with a faint ray of guarded optimism. That's not a strong statement, but it does say that I'm on the positive side rather than the negative side regarding the future.
On that note, thank you, Professor Nye. It made such a great deal to us to have you here with us today.
Well, thank you, Courtney.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.